This, these 2 years you mentioned that you've been focused on carbon. From a farmer perspective, what do you think is the most interesting or sort of enlightening finding that you found that you'd like to share with farmers as a result of the work you've been doing?
Well, so far, the major result is that there are many programs out there that offer very different ways to participate in these voluntary carbon markets, and it's really hard to decide which one suits a particular farm better. So there are so many different variables in place in each program, and they are so different across programs. Uh, Anything from how they measure carbon, how they pay for carbon sequestration or carbon removal, um, the length of the contract, the requirements to participate in the program, and so on. That is really, really hard to um, compare carbon programs before getting a full contract from each of your potential carbon initiatives, right? The initiatives you might be interested in. And that's why we came up with this report, How to Grow and Sell Carbon Credits, um, where we collected data from 13 carbon programs and compared them across 24, 25 different attributes. So to help people, select a smaller set of carbon programs that they might be interested in, and maybe go into some depth in the in learning more about those particular programs. Since there are so many out there, getting to a subset, it's a good first step, basically.
Absolutely. And I was going to ask you what the most significant differences were from one program to the next, but it sounds like from what you're saying, there's just a lot of differences. I mean, there's just a ton of points of differentiation all along the way.
Most certainly, yes. It's not just about, if anything, I would say they are similar in the sense that they tend to accept the same types of practices, what we call covered practices, cover crops, no-till or reduced tillage. Um, those practices are accepted by most carbon programs as the main changes in practices to generate carbon credits. But besides that, there are all kinds of differences across programs. So um, everything from the agronomic standpoint, how these characteristic of additionality is measured or interpreted, to the permanence of the carbon sequestration or removal, um, to the contract length, the how the credit is quantified, how much carbon is sequestered by a specific practice in one field will differ depending on how the carbon removal is measured. So different carbon programs will come up with different amounts of carbon sequestered by the same practice in the same field, uh, under the same operator. So, and that's impossible to know before getting into the contract, I guess. So those are big questions out there. Smaller questions have to do with whether um, there's agronomic assistance provided by the carbon program, whether uh, given that a farmer will implement a change in practices, that change in practice can be cost shared through some NRCS programs. So basically, some of the USDA programs out there to um, to help incentivize the adoption of conservation practices. From the government's perspective, there's no limitation on whether you will use those new practices to produce carbon credits or not. But in some cases, some carbon programs do not allow stacking payments from the public programs with um, payments from these voluntary private programs. So there are lots of things, different attributes that farmers need to be aware of before making decisions.
It's kind of like trying to choose like a credit card, or something like based on all rewards and where you spend your money. And I mean, it's just so many factors. Are are all of them are all of them offering cash payments? I know that was one criteria you had, is payment currency. It looks like all of them are cash, unless I missed some.
No, not really.
Oh,
So eventually you can turn all payments into cash, but there's one program that pays in tokens. So you can say it's a cryptocurrency, but its own cryptocurrency. It's none of the cryptocurrencies um, available out there to trade in the typical platforms. This is an carbon removal token, NRT. Each token is called an NRT, a Nori carbon removal token. For each ton of carbon removed, Nori, which is one of these carbon programs, will issue an NRT. And the farmer who owns the NRT can cash it by selling the token into the Nori trading platform to a buyer, or they can hold the token and wait for the price of this NRT token to go up and sell it at a later time and hopefully at a higher price. But in reality, they are paid in a token, in a cryptocurrency. That's the only one I'm aware of that pays in something other than cash.
right. What about the are are any of the 13 that you reviewed outcomes based, or are they all practices based?
Great question. So most carbon programs are outcome based. So they pay farmers based on their performance, and that is how much carbon they removed or sequestered or avoided putting into the atmosphere over a certain period of time, which is tied to the length of the carbon contract. So far, only one carbon program, Bayer Carbon, actually pays per practice. And I should say, out of the 13 programs that we analyzed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Bayer is the only one paying per practice instead of per outcome. And it pays based on whether the practice is um, adding cover crops to a field or changing the tillage practice to no-till. Um, and it varies by location, but it's usually around $6 per acre if a farmer adds cover crops to a farm, or $5 to $6 per acre if they switch from conventional tillage to no-till or reduced till. Um, the other program that pays per practice to some for some of the practices is Agoro Carbon. Yeah, Agoro Carbon pays uh, for some practices related to reducing nitrogen or managing nitrogen. They pay um, per acre instead of per um, number of tons of carbon removed. So as far as we know they pay 5 cents per, sorry, $2.50 per acre per year for utilizing one of the 4 R's of nutrient stewardship. Um, and that could translate into, well, different amounts based on the nutrient management program. And they also pay for reducing nitrogen application, um, up to 5 cents per pound of nitrogen reduced per acre per year.
Hmm.
So, so far they are the programs that pay per practice.
And I know we're kind of going over a lot of nuances here because all of these seem very different. I guess first, I'm curious, how forthcoming were these 13 companies with these terms? Do they publicize these? Or these usually only once a farmer gets to the contract phase, they get to see these? And how willing were they to share them with you?
Most of this information was collected online, and we um, reached out to these carbon programs to make sure that we were getting the comparisons right. Not all of them provided feedback, so we understand that they didn't see, you know, some major red flags
Right.
in our communication piece. But most of this information is publicly available if you look hard enough. But still, even after looking across these more than 2 dozen attributes for carbon program, there are many questions that remain unanswered. And those are the kind of questions that farmers need to discuss with the carbon program representatives. Um, for example, how are carbon reversals dealt with? So if there's a breach of contract, um, how is the penalty imposed given a breach of contract? What is considered a voluntary versus an uh, involuntary breach of contract? And if there's any clawback clause in case there's a carbon reversal, that is, some of the carbon sequestered or removed over a number of years is intentionally or unintentionally put back into the atmosphere. Well, what happens with that carbon? Uh, is there a point where the farmer would have to pay back in cash to the carbon program um, part of the uh, past payments, basically give the carbon program a compensation for the carbon that went back into the atmosphere when it was supposed to be held in the soil. Um, so there are lots of questions to be asked. And of course, I would certainly try to double check that the information in these tables are current,
Yeah.
because they do change um, frequently. Unfortunately, we learned that at least one carbon program that we listed in the original version of this publication, maybe a year ago, is no longer active. So Gradable Carbon just discontinued its carbon program. They still have interest in working with farmers to create carbon insets and to develop low carbon commodities, but they are no longer issuing carbon credits that they set out to do a year or so ago. Um, and we also learned from other programs that they changed uh, some of the requirements and some of the conditions, these attributes that we have listed for each program, a number of times since we first published this report about a year ago.
Wow. And one of the things that stood out to me in reviewing this table is the length of terms. How long you have to commit to one of these programs. In some cases, 10 years, or 10 years might have been the longest term, but in some cases, 10 years or perhaps more. Um, I guess my question is, what's your sense from a farmer perspective of uh, if it's worth all the trouble to go through and find the program that's right for them and to commit for them for 10 years, is the payback enough? And is that something that you have looked at?
Well, I have looked at the potential to generate carbon credits across all counties in Iowa through major changes in farming practices. Um, and in some cases, the potential to generate enough revenue to justify, from an economic standpoint, the change in practices. It seems to be there, but there's a difference between the expected amount of carbon sequestration, that is an average over a long period of time, versus the actual realization of, on an yearly basis, on the amount of carbon that is actually sequestered. And that depends on a number of factors, weather being one of the major ones, right? Like with any other crop. The carbon crop will depend on the realization of weather patterns and the history of practices in the field and the timing of the changes in practices and so on. So just to put a very simple example, if a farmer this goes into a contract to plant cover crops every year for 10 years, let's say, and one year they have a very early winter, and the ground is frozen by the time they have to or they are able to go into the field with their machines. Well, that cover crop might not be planted at all. Or if they, let's say there's another year where they are able to go in to harvest the corn, soybeans, the cash crop, and plant the cereal rye seeds, if they are doing cereal rye as a cover crop. Well, what happens if the growing degree days after planting the cereal rye seeds are not enough to actually uh, help those seeds germinate? So even if the seed was planted, there's a chance that there won't be germination. And even if there's germination, there might not be enough um, biomass to sequester enough carbon in the fall or in the spring. So it really depends on several variables: the timing of the planting, the conditions of the soil at the time of planting, the number of growing degree days in the spring, in the time to germination in the fall, and so on. And it might just happen that even after going into the cost of buying the seeds and planting the cover crops, the actual results in terms of carbon sequestration is too low, potentially much lower than the average expected number that results from looking at the long-term averages. So a long way of saying that there's a lot of uncertainty, even if you have some information about the expected or the average amount of sequestration for any particular farm. The actual amount of carbon sequestration might differ from that projected, expected, or average amount by quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I only had access to the Comet Planner model that takes into account all greenhouse gases. But there are so many other carbon programs that I have not been able to evaluate um, used by these carbon programs, that it really makes it anybody's guess on how much carbon can be actually sequestered in any given particular year by a change in practice for these carbon programs. So the goal probably right now with current carbon prices might not be to make money for farmers out of these carbon contracts, but to help them move in the right direction of um, adopting more regenerative practices. And it might be that they are already close to breaking even using some public programs, state or federal programs, or they might be able to break even without um, those public programs, and having these carbon payments might bring them from the red to the black and make them um, generate enough revenue for them to be able to cover all the costs or most of the costs to switching to more regenerative practices. Um, so I I don't really see right now a large share of Midwest farmers actually um, extracting high profitability from these carbon programs, but I do see the potential for moving the needle towards more adoption of regenerative practices, um, maybe a little bit slower than what um, many people would like to see, but these are steps in the right direction, and this market is, which I don't think there's a market right now, right? These programs or initiatives are moving in the right direction. And hopefully, if the market solidifies and prices for carbon offsets um, go up, then there might be some profitability um, for farmers and larger scale adoption of regenerative practices. It's a um, very dynamic system right now.
Yeah, no, I appreciate all that explanation because it makes a lot of sense. Where maybe it's not today, maybe it's not the next cash crop. Carbon is not the next cash crop, but it might be just enough to lower the risk of changing practices for somebody who wants to do that anyway, but just is looking to make the finances work. In the example that you mentioned of, let's say, your serial ride doesn't get established, so in that case, let's say hypothetically, the farmer's doing everything the carbon company is saying that they need to do to sequester carbon. Mother Nature doesn't cooperate. Could we actually see a net negative, a loss of carbon from the soil? And then does that get us back to the question you were posing earlier of like, what happens in that case? Do they pay money back? Is that possible that the farmer's doing everything they're supposed to do, but due to other factors, the carbon cycle, we lose soil carbon?
Yes, and I would like to split that into two questions. So, is is it possible from a carbon model standpoint? Remember, all these um, car the way carbon is measured is um, it relies on statistical and biophysical models, right? So, is it possible for these carbon models to actually generate an estimated amount of negative carbon sequestration, so basically putting back some carbon into the atmosphere? The answer to that is yes. If we look at some results in the from the Comet Planner model, there are instances where planting cover crops in some counties would, on average, so I'm not saying that on rare occasions, but on average, generate a negative amount of CO2 equivalent sequestration. So from that's one thing biophysically, yes, that's possible. Then how that affects the contract between a farmer and the carbon program will depend on the specifics of the program and probably on whether the um, the carbon release into the atmosphere was due to intentional or unintentional practices. Um, so, what I hear from the people I had the opportunity to interview in those cases where a cereal rye is not established, the penalty for the farmer would be simply to postpone the carbon payment until there's an actual carbon sequestration. Um, so basically, if the whole carbon program was the contract between the farmer and the carbon program was to have cover crops, well, in a year where the farmer plants the crop but doesn't get established, probably that year the farmer will not receive a carbon payment. The question is, who will bear the cost of buying the seeds and planting the cover crops? Well, that's probably contract specific. Um, the the other question is, what happens with and in that case, if it is um, if it happened because of Mother Nature, probably there won't be um, financial penalties to the farmer. Another question that I don't know how to answer is what happens if there's a need to change tillage practices. For example, in a 10-year contract, a farmer signs to move from conventional tillage to no-till, but let's say that in this area of the farm, the farmer um, cannot treat a specific weed. Let's say water hemp has gone out of control, and the only way to deal with a specific with that specific weed is in basically tilling it and destroying the entire plant and incorporating the plant into the soil. Okay, so there are reasons that um, might force a farmer to go back to conventional tillage. What happens if that reversal occurs in the middle of the contract, of a 10-year contract? Well, from a um, from a carbon perspective, that would result in a loss of carbon that was sequestered into the soil back into the atmosphere. So that's the carbon reversal. And the question that, again, I cannot answer is whether the farmer will have to face the financial penalties or economic penalties for that carbon reversal. Is there a clawback on the payments that the farmer has already collected on the previous years for sequestering carbon? And based on my limited knowledge of the carbon agronomic interaction, uh, maybe up to 40% of the carbon sequestered in the soil can go into the atmosphere with just one tillage pass. Um, so that could be, a great loss for the farmer if that ever happens. But that's, I would say, on top of the uncertainty that we were addressing for the cereal rye, uh, if a farmer is signed to do cover crops.
Yeah, no, that is such an important question to know before entering into one of these agreements, especially if you're going to be 5, 10 years. That's a long time. You better know that before you sign on the dotted line. That's really important. You mentioned practice change and kind of a history of practices. There are a subsegment of the farming population that has been doing, no-till and cover crops for many years before the carbon markets, kind of were a thing. Um, all these platforms, do they all require practice change, meaning if you've been doing this forever, you're not going to get rewarded for that carbon you've sequestered in previous years?
Yes, so far in order to produce a carbon offset, they all require additionalities. And that means that if it weren't for the carbon payment, then the practice would not have been implemented. So it requires a change in practice. There are some programs that allow for a look back period. So if the change in practice occurred recently, let's say over the last 2 or 3 years, then some programs will still allow that farm to participate in the carbon program. Um, the other aspect is that not all of the carbon programs define additionality in the same way. So, yes, there has to be a change in practices, or there has to be something different done in the farm in order to qualify um, to participate in the carbon program and to qualify for a practice to qualify as additional. But in some cases, the additionality, the difference is measured against the farm's own history of practices. So if you if a farmer has been in no-till for the past 10 years, probably that farm will not qualify to generate carbon credits through reduced tillage intensity, although it may still qualify to add cover crops to the no-till system. But there are um, other carbon programs where additionality is measured with respect to the typical practices in the area. That means that for this subset of programs, if a farm has been in no-till and cover crops for 10 years, but both no-till and cover crops have a very low rate of adoption in the county, then that farm is different from the typical farm in the county and would be would qualify to generate carbon credits by continue by continuing the no-till and cover crop practices. So it really depends on the carbon program again.
And with all these different definitions of things like additionality, which is pretty fundamental, and the differences in just how they choose to measure carbon, does that, I mean, to me that feels like it casts a little bit of doubt on the fact that anybody is sort of getting this right. I mean, do you get that sense?
Well, there's a, I would say that the fact that agriculture is one of the sectors producing the least amount of carbon offsets probably is showing to some extent the challenges that agriculture faces in terms of providing credible carbon credits. Um, and I'm not saying that that's not possible. What I'm saying is that it's much easier to show additionality and permanence and realness and so on, the other characteristics that buyers want from these carbon credits, um, by changing practices in other sectors. Think forestry, for example. It's much easier to track the evolution of a forest over 30 years um, than evaluating 30 years of changes in annual practices. But it's not only forestry. Think renewable energy once a windmill is installed, then it's pretty straightforward to measure through a mechanic or electronic instrument how much energy is produced, and compared to compare that energy to the energy produced by coal, for example, and calculate the difference in terms of lower carbon energy generated by the windmill. So it's not that agriculture cannot produce credible carbon offsets. It's only that it's more challenging. There are more processes that need to be put in place, and more information to track on a yearly basis to prove that a change in practices at the farm level has actually removed carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, and that removal um, was credible, and it was additional, and it was permanent. So there's more. There are other variables that probably don't carry such a weight uh, when carbon offsets are generated in other sectors. But still, by the enormous extent of agriculture, um, I think agriculture has a big role to play if these if the buyers are interested in buying carbon offsets from from this sector. Um, and let me tell you, I also learned to some extent about the carbon models used to measure carbon sequestration in forestry. And we all know that forestry carbon credits have been around for decades now. Well, those carbon credits still rely on a different set of carbon models. And these carbon models reach different results.
Hmm.
And they don't converge on a similar amount of carbon sequestration per acre on the same farm. They take into account different variables, the different scales of analysis, and they still don't converge. So I participated in a conference, in a workshop organized by the USDA in Atlanta, Georgia, earlier this year on carbon models for forestry, and there were different groups of modelers um, trying to find a way to compare these models and to understand the differences, so to eventually be able to explain why they arrive at different results when measuring carbon sequestration um, at the forest level.
Yeah.
So this say this carbon modeling for agriculture and particularly for agricultural carbon is much newer than for forestry, or at least that with the same with the interest that we've seen on these carbon models recently, right? So it's a much newer, a much more recent set of models that hopefully uh, will will be able um, to converge to some more similar results as they are discussed more in depth and people make more use of it of
Right.
them. Sorry, there are multiple models.
Have you looked into any of? I hear occasionally about carbon capture technology out there. Is any of that actually being used, or is it still something that we're just hoping for in the future?
No, there are multiple um, instances of direct carbon capture. Um, and I say direct carbon, I should say direct greenhouse gas emissions capture. Um, just in oil rigs on in biorefineries, um, the the process, the gases emitted by the combustion involved in the processes can be directly captured, liquefied, and into carbon dioxide or other gases, and transported to a final storage place. And that's already occurring. There are multiple incentives for the industry to build more infrastructure that would sequester and um, and store greenhouse gases directly into the soil in more permanent uh, um, soil structures. And there's there are multiple incentives around the world to actually build direct carbon capture plants. Right now, the technology is maybe not as cost efficient as desirable, so it's still very costly to do that. It's a great investment, um, and it could be recovered on very long-term contracts, but the technology is being explored for direct carbon capture. So plants that remove carbon directly from the atmosphere, um, those are already being built. They are in operation at a small scale, but eventually, if the interest by both investors, consumers, international leaders, local leaders, if the interest to remove carbon or reduce the carbon footprint or reduce the greenhouse gas footprint of different processes remains strong and probably grows, then there will be economic incentives to um, to generate more carbon sequestration, to generate revenue for those involved in greenhouse gas removal, and it will become a more um, more accepted. No, that's not what I want to say. It's a more prevalent set of technologies. So I don't think there will be one technology dominating the entire carbon spectrum. There are at different um, price ranges. There will be different technologies leading the production of carbon offsets and insets. Agriculture is in between forestry and direct carbon sequestration. So at very low prices for carbon offsets, probably the cheapest way to produce those carbon offsets is through forestry at large scale. Um, then agriculture becomes competitive at higher price points. And eventually, if prices get high enough, let's say $100 per ton of carbon, then um, carbon industrial carbon sequestration and storage becomes profitable. Uh, and the scale for industrial carbon sequestration and storage is much larger than the scale possible with agriculture or forestry. So it's really a Goldilocks type of argument. The price has to be right for agriculture to be competitive, and the models, the methodology also have to be strong, reliable, in order for agricultural carbon credits uh, to work.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's interesting. And whenever I think about this type of thing, I always think, okay, well, this is what's happening now. What's this mean kind of in the next step and down the road? And one thing I think about with this is, we're kind of creating an industry here that doesn't have to only relate to carbon. We're sort of creating the infrastructure for a suite of ecosystem services, sort of a direct pipeline to incentivizing farmers for practice change. Would you agree with that? And do you think that that is the future?
I think there are many people rooting for that future. Um, there are many companies developing programs to expand carbon payments to ecosystem services payments. Um, but it will depend, in my opinion, it will depend on the demand for those types of services and the price of carbon, um, and the reliability, basically how much confidence or credibility is put on those ecosystem services and the carbon offsets or insets. But I do know that there are many people out there looking at ways to promote more the adoption of more regenerative practices. Um, uh, and those channels that you mentioned are one of the main possible drivers of more regenerative agricultural practices. Yes.
Well,
Beautiful.
I know I'm at time, but before I let you go, anything else that you would just want to make sure you mention, or maybe a good way to sum it up is just kind of like, what's one thing you would want farmers to keep in mind before engaging in one of these programs?
If anything, I would highly recommend people interested in exploring carbon farming to do their homework, to read as many reports as possible. Um, I strongly recommend extension reports from the land grant universities. And then after reading the reports, make a big list of questions. And there are some reports that help you create that list of questions, and ask lots of questions to the representatives of the programs you might be interested in before signing any contract, and talk about the carbon program with the family, with financial advisor, legal advisor. Um, Remember that the contracts are made by the attorneys paid by the carbon programs, the aggregators. So it's always in the best interest of those who pay for the contract, right?
Yep.
To the and farmers need to be aware of that, and make sure that they have a good feeling about how to participate, the pros and cons, and the legal consequences if everything goes as expected and if anything goes wrong.
Great. Thank you, Alejandro, very much. I really appreciate this. This is extremely informative and really some great information to anyone who's thinking about these things. So thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to engage in this discussion, and I'm always available via email or phone. So if people want to reach out with more questions, I'll be glad to address them.